Hello everyone, hope you are doing well. Today I will explain to you some of the most important thing about games. What it is horror. Horror in games and terror. We will make a brush through all the story that we could gather, and I will explain to you how this is implemented in games. It differs between the eras of time, but it is basically the same. So I will teach you this difference and we will see how it is implemented. I hope you all enjoy it. And if you don't want to waste your time hearing me blabbing about this story, you can just skip to the conclusion. Now, I'm sure many of you hear about horror in shooter. You have seen games a lot like Resident Evil or War C. What else? Left 4 Dead. You know, there are a lot of games in this kind of setting where you're just like a psychopath with a with a gun shooting everything that moves, and zombies that run like cheetahs and whatever. We will take note of that once we explain what exactly is this horror and terror. Now, let us move on. First of all, we will have to learn the basic. The basic which means that we have to learn the meaning of behind horror and terror, and we'll also check deeper the etymology of both words. Horror, early 14C, feeling of disgust. Late 14C, emotion of horror or dread. Also, thing which excite horror. From Old French horror parentheses 12C, modern French horror, and directly from Latin horror, dread, veneration, religious awe. A figurative use, literally a shaking, trembling, as with cold or fear, shudder or chill. From horror, to bristle with fear, shudder. With this we can understand that horror was basically a reaction that could be from an physical or psychological. In this case, it is in the early horror, it is clearly more focused on what is its physical reaction. Let us check terror. Terror, early 15C. Terror, something that intimidates, punishment, an object of fear, intimidation. From Old French terror, terror, in the 14C, and directly from Latin terrorem, nominative terror, great fear, dread, alarm, panic, object of fear, cause of alarm, terrible news. From terror, filled with fear, fright. And you can take notice of this. There are little similarity between both horror and terror was made later from. Clearly you can notice that terror has a focus on what it is, clearly more than a shake, but it is a fear that is connected with a threat and a reaction. But cool, now let us proceed with another thing. We will now check the meaning on the modern era. Horror, an extremely strong feeling of fear and shock, or the frightening or shocking character of something. In context, it could be in horror. The crow cried out in horror as the car burst into flame. Fill someone with horror. The thought of speaking in front of so many people filled me with horror. To your horror. I then realized, to my absolute horror, that I have forgotten the present. Horror of what the book does combine very successfully. It is the horror of war. And you can take note, the horror of the modern era is differs a lot by from the 14th century, and it's quite amusing that how the language evolved. Now let us check terror. Terror, extreme fear. They fled from the city in terror. There was a sheer, abject terror in her eyes. When he came back into the room, what he said struck terror in my heart. Hayes have whole not terrors for me. You can clearly notice there is a whole different sense on terror from the modern era, and here is more, what should I say, more similar to horror of the modern era. Like both become quite similar the more time it passes. I wasn't considering talking about psychological horror, but it is a topic that we should at least give it a little touch. That being said, we have now checked on that. Now, psychological horror is a subcategory, should we say, that it is not new, but it's not that old either. We have to consider more than a source on this topic, but we will just make mention so you can make yourself an idea of what it is. On this page of the psychological horror, even written across context, this was written by Judith Yell, and she explained that psychological horror is a subgenre that combines horror and psychological fiction. The genre focuses on mental, emotional, or psychological states in order to frighten and disturb the audience. The genre focuses on psychological fears like madness, anxiety, guilt, and paranoia. The genre uses elements of mystery and characters who have an unstable, reliable, or disturbed psychological state. Each element is used to enhance the distressing and disturbing atmosphere. As I was explaining, it is just a fusion of two concepts that it is a way simple, easier to explain, and not so generic as it said horror. With time passed, after all, horror was evolving in too many directions, and especially for games, that is had to be a concept that the consumer or players want to know before playing or buying a game. Now let us see a little bit about what Richard Thomas, a writer, think about this reading psychological horror. So the first thing I want to establish is some sort of baseline understanding of what psychological horror actually is. Here is a good definition from Wikipedia. Psychological horror is a subgenre of horror and psychological fiction with a particular focus on mental, emotional, and psychological state to frighten, disturb, or unsettle its audience. The subgenre frequently overlaps with the related subgenre of psychological thriller, and often uses mystery elements and characters with an unstable, unreliable, and disturbed psychological state to enhance the suspense, drama, action, and paranoia of the setting and plot, and to provide an overall unpleasant, unsettling, or distressing atmosphere. It is easy to understand that there is a very similarity between the both explained concept between what the Wikipedia said and what Judy said before. Based on my reading and the books and films that I enjoy, I sometimes wonder if everything I consume is psychological horror. So let us look at a few things that might not be considered psychological horror. Graphic horror that relies mostly on violence and gore to scare. Action jump scare, horror that relies mostly on cheap tactics or superficial elements to try to get a physical reaction from the audience. Monsters, horror that relies mostly on creators to scare you. Now there is a little something here. Richard explained 3 concepts that, in his reason, there are not related to what is psychological horror. That are graphic horror, action, jump scare, and monster. This could be true and false, depending on how it is used. For example, if it is just a story that describes something like a monster, and is not technical visual for the protagonist in the case, then I don't think that something like that should be considered not related to what is psychological horror. Psychological horror it is a fear of the unknown that is described by some people like Lovecraft. Let me make a quote about what Lovecraft said long ago. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. What is a monster if it's not something unknown to people? In reality, monsters do not exist. So why do we fear monsters? It's because they are uncanny to what humans digest every day. Humans share part of their life with many races that being in the animal kingdom or the flora, the fungi kingdom too. There's many things that humans see every week, every day, every hour, but a monster that is not, that is fiction. And so, what are monsters but nothing that are unknown to humans? Being monsters something that could be graphic or not, it will be always be related to what it is psychological horror. Especially if it is just a ambiguous description of what it is a monster. That's cool, that certain is psychological horror. Why won't you, a human, be scared that something that should not exist and that something that you only read about actually exists and it could also threaten your life? Now, if it is just what it is, a graphic horror, like explained by Richard Thomas, that could be debatable, but on a generic way, violence and just graphic gore, it is really not on the psychological horror part. Will that change if the character itself has lived the horror world and has an extreme trauma related to the murder of a family member or a dear pet that they could have immediately translate to what it is psychological horror? This kind of thing are very dependent on how you play them. It's not like it is incorrect, but it is still way too unfair to discard just like that. Now, after all this reading and information, there is a part that we have to very well consider. So what we have to consider is the relationship between what it is horror and terror. In the modern era, we know very well that they are very related and it could be easily be mistook between two. So we have to dread deeply and see how this can be differentiated between both. Since this is a quite difficult topic, we have to rely on several sources. For one thing, we will study very little each one. Now let us see this. Let us read about a little of this paper, Terror or Horror, a critical analysis of the effects of transition in horror on the characters in the selected novel. Sia Wee Haq, Dr. Abdul Wahid Qureshi, Dr. Rab Nawaz Khan. Introduction. This study deals with the effect of an emotion called fear, which is produced and presented in fiction through various elements and artifacts. It also explains the distinction between terror and horror. With the passage of time, this phenomenon, the fear aroused, is known by various names. For some it is terror, for others horror. In classical fiction, fear was produced by the writer with the help of using different abstract elements such as God, witches, darkness, mysterious voices, and superstition. All of these elements were abstract in nature. They did not have any material or physical shape. People feared them even if they had not seen. These were seen. Since these elements were abstract, so was their effect on the character. On the other hand, modern fiction came up with something extremely different from classical fiction. The modern writers produces fear with something real, or with something that felt real, and consequently, the effect produced over the character was also physical and real. To achieve this end, the researchers have selected the castle of Otranto, 1764, and the turn of the crew, 1898. Among the classical horror fiction and World War C, an oral history of the zombie war, 2006, and Frankenstein in Baghdad, 2018, among the modern horror fiction. The Gothic writer Anne Radcliffe distinguished between terror and horror. She explained that terror and horror are two different feelings based on its functionality. According to her, terror is a feeling of dread, a sort of fear that takes place before an event has happened. It is a fear of something bad to happen. There is uncertainty and obscurity in terror, the abstractness of it, the fear of something that has not been seen, experienced. While horror, she explained, is a different kind of fear, feeling of revulsion or disgust after an event has happened. Horror in its essence is terror materialized, based on Radcliffe's notion as the theoretical perspective. This paper argues that classical horror fiction uses elements of fear to produce terror. There was a fear of something no one has seen in a perfect physical form. Modern fiction, on the other hand, materializes the fears. The object of producing fear becomes concrete, physical, and something that is not more abstract. Thus, the modern fear is not terror, but horror. According to Radcliffe, terror expands the soul and awakens the faculties to a high degree of light, whereas horror contracts, freezes, and nearly annihilates them. It is so because terror is fear of the unknown, something that has not happened, but horror is a sort of fear after experience the horrible. Since terror in classical fiction was abstract, uncertain, and obscure, the characters did not receive or experience any physical assault or effect. It was a continuous fear of something bad to happen, while the horror in modern fiction is material, absolutely certain, and is physical, seen and experienced. Physical fiction produces terror in the reader, but the era is long gone and there is no more terror in modern fiction today. It is pure horror. The reader is no more terrified of abstract events and events, but is horrified by something that has happened and witnessed. We can read, but let us see the Gothic library, horror versus terror, and again there, divide in Gothic literature. Horror, terror, they're synonymous, right? Actually, they're similar, but their meanings are slightly different, especially in the world of Gothic literature. In fact, the terms represent two different schools of thought. The early writers of Gothic literature divide themselves along, and at the beginning, the division occurred loosely along Gandalf lines, as Matthew, Lewis, and Radcliffe were held out as the representative of each camp. Anne Radcliffe, prolific writer of Gothic novels and matriarch of the female Gothic movement, was the first to discuss at length the difference between horror and terror in an essay titled The Supernatural in Poetry. Radcliffe described horror as the cheaper, shock value version of the emotion. Horror is the fear of something concrete, as experienced when one encounters a monster, a specter, or a scene of violence. Terror, on the other hand, is characterized by uncertainty and obscurity. It is the sense of anxiety and dread that comes from the fear of the unknown or the yet come. Radcliffe felt the terror and not horror was the path to the sublime, the ultimate goal shared by romantic poets and many Gothic writers of achieving a higher emotional state, on which fear and awe are intermingled. Radcliffe exemplified this ideal of terror in her own novels, which often feature young heroines trapped in a spooky castle and tortured by ominous sounds outside their doors, and shadows just out of sight. While some followers and imitators of Lewis and Radcliffe continue to perpetuate the horror and terror divide, many writers use a balance of both emotion in their works of Gothic fiction. Stephen King, one of the fathers of the modern horror genre, addressed the topic in this non-fiction book Dance Macquarie, saying, "I recognize terror as the finest emotion, and so I will try to terrorize the reader. But if I find that I cannot terrify, I will try to horrify. And if I find that I cannot horrify, I'll go for the gross out." I think it is more than clear what horror and terror is. From my point of view, I am more a connoisseur of what it is terror. That being said, that doesn't mean that horror is something that should be considered disgraceful to use. In fact, horror is something that chased the humans since ancient times, and so is terror. I think all humans owe respect to what is horror and terror, and both meanings and uses should be considered at any point when someone wants to create a story related to. They are both worth of respect. So, we have learned a lot of things, and I hope so far you have enjoyed it. There is a lot to learn from the past, the story that comes with the horror and terror genre. There is a little something that I avoided to mention, but it was mentioned by Richard. That is jump scare. Richard mentioned that jump scares are quite a cheap artifact used, and I quite concur with him. But, and there is the interesting part about jump scare. They are indeed cheap, but it is like not so bad depending on how are used and how often are used. As a comparison, jump scare are like junk food. They are quite tasty when you eat them, but it is not something that you should usually eat, or it will ruin your body. In this case, horror and terror, jumpscare, it is something that you should or you may use for your own good, but do not go overuse it. Don't put one jump scare in every single map or every 5 minutes. No, don't do that. Use it just in certain parts, and hopefully, depending on how long your game is and how varied it is, you should don't use more than 5 jump scare. The fewer you use, the better. In some cases, maybe just one in the right occasion will be enough. Now, with that end, bravo! We finished every single subject that this video should abord. Now, the next part that we must talk about is, of course, the conclusion. The conclusion is quite simple. Horror, it is the visual or tactful feel of fear, mostly come from one of the 5 senses of the human body. Those are sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. On the other hand, we have terror, that it is the mindful fear of fear. It is mostly come from the sense of self-dread. It is, in other words, a self-inflicted fear. As for psychological horror, it is an intermingled concept of fear that comes from psychological fiction and horror. Even so, when it is analyzed deeply, you will come to elements that are closer to what it is terror. When it comes to horror, terror, psychological horror, a lot of this is subjective. What I'm trying to say here is, aside from the facts that are the meaning of the modern and the previous eras, you should take these comparisons and subjectivity about horror and terror with a pinch of salt. It is something that you want to learn. Well, if you are here, maybe you were interested. But how far you should go with these meanings, subjective meanings, that depends on how you will use it. As a general information, I think it is okay to know. Now, if you want to apply these terms on your literature, you want to write something or create a game or some kind, then it really worth making a distinction to enrich the story, enrich the fear you want the consumer feel. If you are just an amateur or just were bored or whatever, you don't need to take this so serious. It doesn't have to be that way. Currently, there are 3 tags, shall we say. Technically, in literature, there is one genre that should be horror. The terror genre technically doesn't exist commonly, so some authors, like Radcliffe, make sure that their books are categorized as terror. If you go to a library, you will see that their books are anyway horror. Psychological horror, on the other hand, it is more common in literature. And so for games, in literature, not so often, but you will see the category for psychological horror or just psychological. Some may go more specific. As for terror, in literature again, and for games too, there is no hard distinction for that. You will only see horror or psychological horror. So for your own good, don't take these things so serious if you are a casual consumer. Of course, don't stop yourself from doing something more interesting or going deeper on the subjects. If you are really interested, that is the only way for things to keep growing. And maybe someday the tag terror as a category too will start existing as a commonplace. No, everything that was too mean to be said was said. So, I hope every one of you, my dear devotees and the casual people that are checking here just for curiosity, thank you for coming, thank you for listening to this bunch of story and meanings. I have fun making this video and I hope you have fun hearing my messy dialect. But yeah, everything will be links will be in the comments, of course, on the description. If you quite dislike my way of narrative, I apologize for that. I really have to improve my pronunciation and English in general. But anyway, it was fun for me. Again, I hope you have fun too, and I see you next time. After all this, I want to set a little carpet before I start making reviews of several games, mostly horror or mystery. Bye bye, and I hope you all keep me company further. Until next time. Also, please like and subscribe, it will be very meaningful to me.